Welcome back. I'm continuing my conversation with author and campaigner. He's former ANC Member of Parliament, Andrew Feinstein. He's talking to us from London. Andrew, just talk me through the 7 myths that are in your book, Indefensible. Can you mention some of those?
Sure. Well, the first is that the global trade in weapons makes us more safe. We argue, I believe quite convincingly, that it actually makes us less safe. So, for instance, buying a jet called the F-35 for $1.5 trillion, which the United States has just done, where some people in defense intelligence in the United States are saying this aircraft, which first of all is technically a very bad aircraft, will have no relevance to US national defense or security for generations to come, would be an obvious example. The second one is that they're very good for our economies. As I mentioned before the break, they're an incredibly poor way of growing an economy or creating jobs. The fact that corruption is restricted in the arms trade to countries of the global south. So we all know in South Africa about the 16 charges, 783 counts of fraud, corruption, and racketeering against Jacob Zuma. And you know that this is the main corruption in the arms trade. At the same time that BAE Systems was paying £115 million of bribes on the South African arms deal, it was paying bribes on deals in 7 or 8 other countries around the world. So it was BAE Systems that was promoting corruption across the world to the tune of billions and billions of pounds. So who is more corrupt? Those who receive the bribes or those who are paying them out in various parts of the world? And then there are myths like the world has never been more dangerous, where actually, in fact, in spite of certain regions like the Middle East that we mentioned earlier, the world is going through one of its more peaceable moments in human history. So these are the sorts of myths that we deconstruct with facts and with case studies, just to let ordinary people engage with the reality of this arms trade, with the weapons industry, that is really being undertaken and promoted in their name and with their tax money.
Now, I want to know from you, given the research that you have conducted and observing the situation around the globe, the role of media in all of this and financial institutions. I'm curious to know who's funding these wars and why are they not generating that much of interest? I'm thinking of situations such as in Yemen that you mentioned earlier on, in South Sudan, and many years ago, around 94, thereabouts, the genocide that we saw in Rwanda. And there probably are other smaller wars going on. I mean, we've seen the destruction in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Absolutely.
And of course, the small weapons trade. These weapons are imported from the countries that we mentioned earlier on, the UK, the US, Germany, and others.
Yeah. I'll come to the role of the media and particularly the issue of secrecy in just a moment. But let me start by saying that the funding of these wars happens primarily through our own governments, who have, in particularly the weapons-producing countries, have huge defense budgets. And these defense budgets are effectively feeding what is called by the former Chief of Staff of the US Secretary of State and most senior military general before that, General Colin Powell. His Chief of Staff describes this grouping as a very small national security elite who move through a revolving door between government, private companies, intelligence agencies, and consultancies to effectively ensure that the world remains favoring war as a solution rather than diplomacy. This is reflected by the fact that the United States of American government employs more people to run one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire globe. And the United States of America currently has 11 aircraft carriers. So there is definitely a warlike approach to solving disputes in the world. But this is obviously informed not only by the weapons-making companies, but by those enablers of these transactions. And banks here are absolutely crucial. So just as we've seen service providers, be it auditors, be it management consultants, be it financial institutions, aiding and abetting the process of state capture in South Africa during the Zuma years, so on a global level, we are seeing these same service providers and institutions enabling and effectively condoning this out-of-control trade in weaponry and in war out of which they make a huge amount of money. And so because you have such embedded interests and such powerful interests promoting conflict over diplomacy, it is far more likely that conflict will win out. And here is where the media has a crucial role to play. And you're quite right, Tim. There are certain media outlets, and I think in South Africa we're really fortunate. We have a great investigative media. I think our investigative media, both broadcast and print and social media, is actually better in South Africa than in many parts of the world, including the United Kingdom and the United States today, where media companies don't invest in investigations anymore, and where they steer away from projecting the realities of war on our TV screens every day. And a brilliant former New York Times war correspondent, Chris Hedges, says in the film of Shadow World, if the taxpayers who are funding America's various wars around the world were shown the real images, the awful, brutal images of those wars, they wouldn't allow 1 cent of their tax dollars to be invested in wars. And that is why those real images, like in Yemen today, are kept off our screens and out of our newspapers, because they would simply be too horrific for ordinary citizens like you and I to be able to countenance supporting this. But what really makes the war industry tick over is the fact that everything that takes place in an arms deal, everything that takes place in a military operation, takes place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy.
Well,
and of course some elements of national security and defense need to be kept secret, but all sorts of criminal elements are also being kept secret at this time.
Well, that leads me to two questions then. Your interest in the arms deal, because you were one of the people at the forefront of exposing the arms deal here in South Africa, to the extent that you had a fallout with your colleagues and your organization, the ANC, when you were MP. Why were you so tenacious in pursuing this matter to the end, even though you probably would say it's not over yet, but the Seriti Commission has set and has come up with its own recommendations? So two parts to the question. The first one was your interest and the tenacity with which you followed up on the matter. Yeah. And I would like to hear your comment on the conclusions and recommendations of the Seriti Commission.
Certainly. In terms of why I pursued it in the way that I did, and have written about it extensively, is that I believe it was the moment at which our very young democracy, at this point, we're talking about 1999, 2000, 2001, the point at which we lost our moral compass, the point at which it was okay to use state contracts to effectively pay bribes to people who were involved in the decision-making on those contracts. Now, even if we set aside the $300 to $400 million US of corruption that was involved in our arms deal, even if we set that aside for a moment, and we consider that we spent $10 billion on weaponry that we really didn't need, that we've barely used until today, and this at a time when our president and our government was telling us we didn't have the fiscal resources to provide antiretroviral medication to 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS at that time, leading, according to a Harvard University study, to the avoidable deaths over a 5-year period of 365,000 South African citizens, the birth of over 30,000 HIV-positive babies a year every year for 5 years. But it was also due to something else, Tim. You know, we are celebrating the centenary of Nelson Mandela, and I will never forget one of our very first ANC caucus meetings that I sat in, where Mandela said to us, "You, the elected MPs, are not important people. The important people are the people who have elected you to represent them here. They are the people who pay your salary. They are the people who you are here to serve. And when you stop serving them, you stop being of any use to our young democracy, which so many gave so much to see brought about." And I took that seriously.
Sure.
And I believed that billions of dollars of public money, of taxpayers' money, was being used inappropriately and for corrupt purposes. And all that has happened since then is that I've seen more and more evidence to confirm that. And unfortunately, the Sariti Commission, which was set up by Jacob Zuma when he was president, was set up exclusively to whitewash corruption in the arms deal. And the main proof for that is myself and colleagues sent hundreds of pages of evidentiary documents to Judge Willie Sariti. He refused to admit them, saying that they were stolen documents because I, for instance, was not the author of a minute of a meeting at a German weapons company where the executives acknowledged they'd been asked for a $3 million bribe by Chippy Sheikh, and they took the decision to pay the bribe. So it was only the company secretary of that German company, Judge Sariti claimed, that could present that evidence to the commission. Now that means investigative journalism shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
It means that our entire existence should take place in secrecy, which is obviously a nonsense. So I'm
Well, I want to squeeze in just a quick question here, if you could indulge me, Andrew. Just a brief comment. I said I wanted to ask your views on the secrecy bill and your concerns. Very brief response to that.
I wrote, my first book was called After the Party, about the South African deal and the corruption in that deal. If the secrecy bill had been law when I published that book, I could have been sent to jail for upwards of 5 years simply for publishing that book. So I believe that secrecy is used by governments to protect governments from the malfeasance or inappropriate activity, including corruption, that they engage in. So to have a secrecy bill like is envisaged in South Africa would be a massive detriment to our democracy. It would ensure that we, the people of South Africa who pay our elected office bearers and officials, would not know what they're actually doing in our name with our money. And in a democracy as vibrant as South Africa's, that in my mind would be unacceptable.
Andrew Feinstein, thanks very much for talking to us, and thanks for the insights and the work that you do. And that's all we had for you this evening. Andrew Feinstein talking to us from London there. And thank you for being part of the Modise Network. I'm inviting you to join me again tomorrow at 6 p.m. as we talk to the president of Busa Sipho, as well as the CEO of Signia, Magda Vishaka. And good night to you.